Story 1. If it were even just a one-time allotment, it would transform United States education, and I generally dislike the word transform in education. We could address physical infrastructure, increase teacher salaries, bring every school up to date with basic technology, invest in mental health care on an unprecedented scale, and nearly eradicate food insecurity among children in school. That $265 billion could be placed in an endowment, and the returns alone would be life-changing for almost everyone. Story 2. Politicians and contractors find ways to funnel large amounts of money into their pockets, similar to current practices with Department of Defense funds. For decades, it has been known that the Department of Defense is unable to audit trillions of dollars in transactions. If the Department of Defense really wanted the United States government to save money, they would have started with military spending. Story 3. The United States spends more money per student than almost all countries in the developed world. More money will not solve the problems. How the money is spent and what is being taught are the two main issues. Story 4. You have an apples to oranges problem here. Education is funded at the state level, and the military is funded at the national level. While some funds may be allocated to the states by the federal government, it is still up to the state to decide how and if to use those funds. Some states have given up on initiatives that would help their poorer citizens because they wanted to take a political stance regarding the presidential administration involved. Worse, funding flows down to school districts. So, while a state might receive millions of dollars to improve school buildings, with the idea that air conditioning is helpful in hot weather, what actually reaches a school district might end up being used for remodeling a principal's office instead. Story 5. We would be spending much more money without achieving any tangible results. Education spending since the 1970s has increased dramatically with very little improvement, if any. Story 6. Literally nothing would help improve education at the student level. Most of the funding would be funneled to technology and consulting companies. Very little would go toward hiring more teaching staff. The most effective approach would be to roll back many of the most damaging policies that have been implemented and introduce new policies that greatly empower actual educators instead of administrative staff. Story 7. The United States already spends more money on education than any other developed nation. As it turns out, more money is not the answer. Story 8. Probably nothing. The federal government spends $119 billion on education. Including state and local funding, the total is $857.2 billion. But the question was about military funding going to education, so let's focus on that. We are higher than the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development average in every meaningful category. In college per pupil funding, we are at $36,274, which is 77% higher than the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development average. In elementary per pupil funding, we are at $15,270, which is 28% higher than the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development average. While we are not first in this specific category, the countries ahead of us have much smaller populations: Iceland, Norway, Luxembourg, Denmark, and Austria. In secondary school per pupil funding, we are at $16,301, which is 22% higher than the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development average. But in fairness, we are in 8th place behind Norway, Austria, South Korea, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and Australia. However, our test scores are around or slightly above the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development average. The takeaway here is that we cannot solve a problem by throwing money at it. Education is a fiscal black hole. You can spend however much you want, and it will still never be enough. The problem is not money. The problem is how we educate. We have a very inefficient system that is more interested in preparing students for tests than in actual learning or understanding. We have a similar problem as China, which typically does very well on tests but is not very good at using the information taught in an organic manner. Story 9. The problem is that the United States already spends a huge amount on education, but it is mostly misspent on poor contracts, administrators, and so on. Very little money finds its way to actual teaching. A similar effect happens in United States healthcare. Huge spending, exploited workers on the front lines, and terrible outcomes. A bigger benefit to society would come from redirecting some wasteful military spending to infrastructure repair and development. But again, it is going to be misspent on poor contracts and administrators. Story 10. Unfortunately, it would not do much. There are more than 13,000 kindergarten through 12th grade school districts in the United States. Using rounded math, you get about $2.5 million increase per district. This seems like a lot, but even in a small district like the one I work for, that is not enough to do much. It would help, but it is really not as much money as you think. Just replacing the 30-year-old air handling equipment in one of our buildings would use that amount. We are trying to pass a $4 million bond just for that purpose. Yes, it is a lot of money, and it would drastically help with infrastructure, but it would not change education significantly. Our schools are way underfunded by much more than that. Story 11. Linda McMahon would arrange for a World Wrestling Entertainment-style educational system smackdown, and we would all lose. Oh wait. Story 12. It depends on whether the resources actually reach the classrooms or if the administration takes the majority of them for themselves, as usual. Story 13. If that happened right now, the money would be funneled to private for-profit schools owned by donors to the president. Story 14. A zero-debt universal free college program could be funded 5 times over with that much money. We could probably achieve the best educational outcomes in Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries within 10 years or so with less than half that money, although to be honest, at a certain point, that money would see diminishing returns. Story 15. I think it would help a little in schools. Schools in the United States have a problem, and it's not about money. Yes, some of it is, but the vast majority is not actually about money. I don't say this lightly. I have a vested interest in saying money would fix it. I have 2 uncles, 3 aunts, both my mother-in-law and father-in-law, as well as my wife, who either work or have worked in public education as teachers. My uncle was a principal but started as a teacher for most of their lives. The first problem is that the money rarely, if ever, even makes it to the school. My father-in-law and uncle, who worked for 2 different school systems in 2 completely different states, have said the same thing. For every dollar gained through grants, federal funding, and similar sources, maybe 65 cents makes it to the school corporation. Before it reaches there, that money has to go through several legislatures, committees, and people, all of whom are paid out of that money. Once in the corporation, about half, around 10 to 20 cents, remains with the corporation to help pay for administrator salaries and contractually obligated raises. Upper-level public school officials often receive a high salary. The superintendent of the school system where I grew up makes more than $200,000, which was a lot of money when I was young, and he wasn't even the highest paid. They had 3 consultants who received significant compensation for various services. The technology consultants were paid the most, at least until an in-house group could be established. That contract, which helped get smartboards into a handful of rooms, was more than $1 million over 3 years, and my school got 2 smartboards, one in the library and another in the media room adjacent to the library. Another 10 cents goes to equipment that might be needed elsewhere, such as printers and computers. The remaining 35 cents goes to the school. Sounds good, right? But no. Of that 35 cents, more than half, about 20 cents, goes to other programs, sports, clubs, initiatives, after-school programs. The rest goes to actual education that directly benefits students. But that's just the first problem. The second problem is a big one, too, and it is multifaceted. We can call it systemic problems. This includes things like inter-school funding inequalities. For example, in a system with 2 schools, each gets 50% of the budget. However, one school has a graduation rate of 80% and the other has 90%. Now, the school with the 90% graduation rate only gets 40% of the budget. The other school receives 60%. Most of that 60% goes to sports because it is a simple way to increase graduation rates. This occurs everywhere. Schools that produce better students receive less funding. Administrators have a vested interest in maintaining their share of the budget while also aiming for good graduation rates. This leads to the second facet: standardized testing and teaching to the test. Teaching to the test is a poor way to educate children, but it is an efficient way to test them, especially when teachers must grade 6 classes worth of homework every night. Students who do their homework often learn the answers to the test but cannot apply concepts going forward, so a lot of time must be spent reviewing material already taught. Test scores and pass rates look good, but students are not well educated, except for exceptional students who truly understand the material. Schools start initiatives by grouping these exceptional students who learn faster than others. However, they still learn at different rates, which creates competition among these students for top student. This contributes to clique problems and bullying. Schools then must start anti-bullying initiatives, which divert more funds. There is one more facet: student and parent participation. If the students and parents do not care, no amount of funding will help. Schools must find ways to ensure that students are invested in their own futures. Story 16. On the education side, there is nothing other than more fraud, waste, and abuse because past experience suggests that no increase in funding has ever resulted in a significant increase in performance. On the world politics side, China would invade Taiwan and possibly attack Japan. Japan's social programs would collapse as they are forced to increase defense spending to fight off China. North Korea might invade South Korea. Iran and others would hold Europe hostage. Through the Strait of Hormuz, Russia would press the North Atlantic Treaty Organization even more. European countries would collapse as they could no longer afford their own social programs while trying to make up the defense expenditure deficit from the United States. Overall, this is not the rosy picture that the political left and those with their heads in the sand want to paint. Story 17. How is it being spent? Inflation-adjusted, per-student spending is twice what it was in the early 1980s. May I suggest that it is not school spending that is the problem? I am not saying it is all the school's fault either. I think everyone agrees that schools can only do so much if the children's home lives are terrible. Even where the issue is with schools, it is not all on the teachers. A cursory glance at the percentage of the school budget going to administration over time rather than the actual classroom will show that. There is plenty of money in the system. The American public education system spends more money on students than just about any other country, with minor exceptions like Luxembourg and Norway, and achieves below expectation results for that money. It is obvious that throwing money at the problem is not the solution. Story 18. We are already near the top of the list for dollars per student spending and ranked low on educational outcomes. Throwing more money at a dysfunctional system will not produce better results. Story 19. This happened in the 1960s. As part of the push for the space program, state and federal governments invested a lot of money into the education system. The result was a more educated population and an expansion of the middle class. Note that Republicans have been reversing those gains ever since. Story 20. Many positive aspects exist in United States education. Many countries are no longer experiencing freedom-related bombings. Overall, the situation is improving. Story 21. I am seeing a wide range of numbers online, but this is approximately enough money to make higher education free for every American. Story 22. Low education has resulted in our country being full of people who are easily persuaded by misinformation and unable to distinguish fact from fiction. The country would theoretically benefit in the long run from a significant increase in education spending. Unfortunately, we would still have some of the least competent people in the world managing our education system. Story 23. The Republican Party would no longer exist in 20 years. They could not have support without the uneducated, the hateful, and the racist. Story 24. Flying cars and science that is indistinguishable from magic. Alas, doing so would impact many billionaires, so it is unlikely to happen. Story 25. If people were educated, members of the Republican Party would never get elected. However, I believe investing in healthcare is a higher priority. I also think we could cut the military budget in half and fund both. Story 26. Not sure. Maybe have some type of parent expectations training and other programs that may incentivize parent involvement. This would be in addition to the funding that is aimed to bolster student development. Story 27. Money is not the issue. The United States spends plenty. There are many studies available that identify unmotivated parents, students, ineffective administration and curriculums, and a lot of mediocre teachers as contributing factors. Story 28. Depends on the education. Are we talking about government education? So it probably would not help things much. Story 29. Okay, so I am a cynic. If 30% of the United States military budget were redirected to education, we would have much more administrative overhead, higher salaries, and educational outcomes that are largely unchanged. Was it not proven long ago that there is no correlation between education dollars per student and improved student outcomes? Also, the schools would still be begging for more money. Story 30. It would probably be mishandled and allocated poorly. A portion of it would be funneled to line the pockets of corrupt politicians pretending to support the people. Teachers would still be underpaid and buying their own classroom supplies. Story 31. Very little, if anything, would change. The problem with education is not only monetary. Many people choose private or homeschool options because trust in public schools has eroded. More funding will not fix that. Story 32. Realistically, there is probably no benefit to education according to any data metric. The price per person has generally been increasing without corresponding benefits. People around Washington, D.C. tend to profit from studies and nonprofit organizations. China might make a move on Taiwan, leading to increased global instability along with political reshuffling in the United States. Story 33. Or liquidate the $24 billion worth of seized Bitcoin the Trump administration is holding and give it all to education. Story 34. Most likely, multiple countries around the world would start planning hostilities against the United States. These plans would not take hold overnight and would take quite some time to come to fruition. On the other hand, significant funding into education would begin the process of remedying issues within the education system in the United States. This would also not happen overnight. Eventually, the military of the United States would begin to fall apart and crumble. The United States would likely lose strategic military bases, and its status as a global power would decline. It is unclear how that much money would help education, but it would likely assist in some ways. It could also provide many avenues for corruption, as current oversight is not as strong in education as it is in the military. Then it becomes a race to see which military power would begin a hostile invasion of distant United States territories, potentially leading to an invasion of the contiguous United States. Story 35. A number of education corporations were created to offer overpriced services or curriculum to schools. Friends and family of the school board and administration received lucrative no-bid contracts. Real estate was purchased. For teachers and students, however, nothing fundamentally changed. The education system is broken and corrupt throughout its entirety, and throwing money at it only benefits the charlatans and grifters who already make substantial profits from education. Story 36. I would ask how that makes the children smarter. Someone might respond that paying teachers more would attract better teachers, but the unions will not support districts firing underperforming teachers. Hiring more teachers to reduce class size might help, but there will still be poor teachers who underperform. Money does not always correlate with better outcomes, as shown by the current spending per student and test scores. So the question remains. Story 37. My wife is a teacher, and my mother is a retired teacher. I know many other people who work in education. My son is currently in college to become a teacher. Money is not the primary problem. You could give every teacher and support staff a 25% raise, but it will not fix the problem of students who are undisciplined and do not want to learn or parents who are uninvolved. Story 38. I think the change depends on the students, not the money. They have been influenced by their friends not to like school. While external factors can be helpful, students may still dislike going unless they have good teachers and an environment with friends that supports a healthy view of school. It sounds ideal, but the outcome ultimately depends on the students, not the money. Story 39. The United States spends about $800 billion federally on education. The United States spends about $250 billion on education at the federal level. The United States spends over $2 trillion on education at the state and local levels. What would happen if we added $260 billion to $2.3 trillion? Not very much. All the posts self-congratulatory saying otherwise do not care enough about education, actually, as opposed to education as a virtue signal, to bother understanding how education or the military is funded. Story 40. We have spent more than ever on education but are not achieving significantly better results. This is not a funding issue. Story 41. I am sure the politicians would still manage to send billions in educational aid packages to Europe instead of spending it locally somehow. Story 42. They invested a large amount of money into the Department of Education, but it was ineffective. Story 43. It would immediately be spent on football stadiums, swimming pools, administrative salaries, and administrative pensions. Story 44. The United States has already spent a large amount of money on education in the past with little results. Ultimately, it is the parents who are responsible for how their children view the importance of education, and all the money in the world will not change that. Story 45. Switching a budget without changing the people would be a waste of money. Teacher unions need to focus more on students than on teacher salaries and benefits. Story 46. The United States military budget is about 10 times the education budget, approximately $877 billion versus $76 billion according to Google. That is the federal budget, so I suspected that to be about half of total education spending, including state and student-paid tuition. Another quick Google search estimates all education spending to be about $857 billion. Taking 30% of the military budget would move about $263 billion to education. It probably would not change education significantly but could improve access by reducing or eliminating tuition. Some improvement in quality could occur as more and better teachers could be hired, boosting wages and benefits. It is not as substantial as I originally thought if education had a total $70 billion budget, but it would still be quite helpful. Story 47. As long as it did not come with religion attached to it, then it would do amazing with the caveat that you weed out any corruption and the money goes towards education, not contractors or politicians. But breakfast and lunch services are contracted. You are correct. This is where the caveat comes into play of weeding out corruption. The cost of meals is currently very low, but for low-quality food. Japan, for instance, has high-quality food that is served. The children participate in cooking, cleaning, and other activities. We could easily do the same by just purchasing ingredients and giving schools a well-equipped kitchen, letting the kids learn to cook under supervision. This same principle applies to any other contracted service. Bulk rates should be applied for things like computers and lab equipment. Any company trying to charge more than the standard cost should be blacklisted from participating without a compelling argument as to why they are charging more. For example, demonstrable qualitative differences that justify the cost and that the cost is publicly disclosed. You cannot have a 1% improvement in performance but charge 100% more. Food quality cannot be 1% better but have a 250% markup. Costs should be relative to the increase in manufacturing or production of the goods supplied. What about the religious side? You can spend infinite amounts of money, but science, mathematics, logic, and reasoning require separation from religion because critical thinking is necessary. Religion promotes less logical thinking as you have to suspend the rules of logic and reasoning to have faith in something. This is fine, no insult intended. Faith is meant to be by faith, and those who believe and try to inject science into it are not showing faith. They are trying to add post hoc reasoning to something irrational, and it does not work in reality. Again, it is fine to be religious, but religious institutions do not produce top scientists and mathematicians who make breakthroughs. They can, but usually do not. Secular science and mathematics are the way. My overall take is that opening the funding floodgates with nearly $300 billion in funding would effectively transform the economy today for those in education and the economy in general in the future. Would it happen in reality? No. Too many people think we need $1 trillion annual budget for military spending when, in reality, we do not. We spend extra on research and development with little extra to show for it. We pay not just cost plus profit, but the profit margins are ridiculously high for government contractors. A bolt that costs $5 to manufacture is charged at $50 or more to the United States government, and we pay it. This is corruption. There is nothing to justify a 1,000% markup except greed and corruption. With that money changing hands, too few politicians are willing to give up their slush funding to do the right thing. Story 48. It would do nothing for grades. Hopefully, teachers would get a raise, but those who want to learn are already learning. Story 49. If people were smarter, we would see many fewer cases of Trump derangement syndrome. I mean the real definition, not the one the deranged supporters of Donald Trump use. Story 50. Nothing, because you cannot teach people who are not ready to be taught. You can spend millions of dollars on upgrading school infrastructure. If the children feel like vandalizing those things, that is what they will do. You do not need a lot of expensive things to teach children. The children have to be willing to learn, and their parents have to understand that education is the responsibility of the schools, the children, and the parents themselves. Where I went to school as a child, all the parents were involved in the school. Most of the parents were quite literate. At home, the children would read and do homework, and the parents did not complain about the amount of homework. That is not the case today. Spending money will not fix the education problem in the United States. Consider the grammar questions that arise on online forums. Someone asked the other day when saying eyes became acceptable, as if it ever was. Story 51. Salespeople and administrators would immediately take most of it. We need true reform, not just money. Everyone deserves a high-quality education, and that means completely changing school funding and resource allocation, and dramatically improving curriculum development. Story 52. It depends on where it goes. Does it actually go to the classrooms, or does it go to testing companies such as Pearson? Story 53. Probably not much. Education-adjacent people like consultants and researchers would get richer. Some school buildings would get upgrades and teachers would get a bit of a raise. None of that has much to do with the quality of education itself, though. The United States is already one of the highest spenders on education in the world. Story 54. Graft. Education consultants are emerging to sell new educational pedagogy strategies, such as making students learn while standing on their heads. Everyone will agree and pretend it is the best new idea, spending millions to implement the curriculum in schools. The principal will insist that everyone try it, so teachers will do it half-heartedly for a year. It will fail, and then they will move on to the next educational scam the following year. Story 55. I want to believe that it would help improve the education of our children, but the reality is we would just end up with more National Football League-style football stadiums and overpaid administration. Story 56. If allocated correctly to school systems that need upgrades, such as those in inner cities and rural areas where funding is limited due to public schools being funded by property taxes, it could do a lot of good. It could reintroduce shop classes and other vocational courses to give students a path other than college if they choose. Many positive outcomes could result from implementing such changes. Story 57. Not sure it would make all that much difference. It will help, sure. But the family is the factory that turns out the citizen, and our families are stressed and fragmented in a way that they are turning out children who are not ready to learn and may never be. About 35 years ago, when $100,000 was a lot of money, a group of us high school teachers were in the teacher's lounge over lunch. I asked one of them if his salary was suddenly increased to $100,000. Would he be a better teacher? Would his students have better outcomes and learn more? He really gave it some thought and said, "No, there's a lot we can do, but we cannot work miracles. If there is no way to increase the quality and readiness of the children entering the pipeline, there is not much more a teacher can do." Back then, as now, the greatest single predictor of a child's academic success is the income level of that child's parents. In other words, we need to stamp out poverty and give lots of support to parents. Story 58. Effectiveness depends on more than just the budget. Even unlimited funds cannot compensate for a poorly designed or executed education program. Story 59. We have spent more per capita on education in the last 15 years than ever before. It is not solely a money issue. The District of Columbia spends the most money per capita at a rate of $27,425 per student. Yet, in 2024, the average score of fourth-grade students in the District of Columbia on the National Assessment of Educational Progress was lower than the national average. While students in the District of Columbia showed improvement in their performance between 2022 and 2024, their scores remained below the national average and were either just meeting or still below pre-pandemic levels. Story 60. We would start following the money and not just what we see. Americans would lose all sense of global moral superiority, resulting in an existential crisis and a decline into authoritarianism. Oh wait, Story 61. Honestly, very little. The United States has a culture problem, not an information problem. It does not matter if you teach the right material in the classroom. An example of this is financial education. People say we do not get enough financial education in our school system. They might be right in some ways, but at the same time, if you ask 10 random Americans if having credit card debt is good or bad, 9 out of 10 would say it is bad. Yet many of them still have credit card debt. Would education really fix that problem? It seems they are already aware it is a bad thing. Story 62. Probably nothing good. The United States already spends more on education than other countries that outperform the United States. The problem is not an economic problem. Story 63. It does not matter because it will never happen. An uninformed population is easier to manipulate, which is why there is so much disinformation on the internet. Just take a look at how many people believe in the flat Earth while simultaneously using global positioning system navigation in their day-to-day lives, which require satellites that orbit the Earth to be accurate. Story 64. The problem with United States education is not just about money. It is about the culture. If the culture is not fixed, improvement will not occur. In fact, adding more money to a bad culture could worsen the problem. Another issue is that this may lead to difficulties in providing adequate armament to allies such as Ukraine. Story 65. 1/4 of the budget is just service member pay. So you are looking at approximately a 44% reduction in spending for everything else. You are going to cut back on readiness today or readiness in the near and far future. Story 66. No more Make America Great Again hats in a generation, as people would be getting actual educations again in this country, including civics, art, history, physical education, and exercise, more than just rote science, technology, engineering, and mathematics content. Story 67. It would be wasted almost immediately by incompetent or corrupt district officials. The education system is in a vicious catch-22 and self-fulfilling prophecy. It is chronically underfunded because of widespread waste and corruption, but waste and corruption persist because all competent and honest people leave the education system as soon as they see how bad it is. The United States education system needs a complete overhaul before we invest large amounts of money in it. Story 68. If sustained funding continued over a generation, the entire nation would collapse and be remade. Much of what is done in the United States is nonsense, and if people saw it clearly, the status quo would not be upheld. Story 69. The United States government and education system do nothing better than embezzling every dollar they can. Story 70. Unless the parents receive training, nothing will change. However, the unions and teachers will earn significantly more money. Story 71. That money would come with conditions. Therefore, Donald Trump would have enormous power over local school districts. Story 72. It would do some good and definitely help address the teacher shortage, but money will not fix the education system unless there is a legitimate, well-thought-out plan too. You cannot pay parents to discipline their children. Money does not automatically buy a good curriculum and policy. Money does not prevent schools from focusing on sports more than academics and infrastructure. There is a lot more to America's education problem than simple financial issues. Story 73. I do not know, I feel like in the end we would end up with high schools looking like they do in the South, with huge sports facilities and not much else. The population has to value education to get the most out of that money. Also, the Los Angeles Unified School District 2025 budget was $18 billion, so $265 billion is not a lot when you look at all 50 states. Story 74. My prediction is nothing much. The United States is already one of the top spenders per pupil in education. There are caveats. The way education is funded in the United States largely depends on the district and the state, because everything is complex. Some districts are very poor and some are very rich. Poor districts generally have worse outcomes than median districts. However, it is not necessarily as simple as giving them more money, because confounding factors like parental income also play a part. I am not a fan of military spending, but it is worth noting that not every problem the United States has is simply a matter of not spending enough on the problem. Story 75, we would have much better education overall, which would significantly reduce the Republican voter base since, statistically, the more educated a person is, the less likely they are to vote that way. That is why we will never see it happen in the current political climate. Story 76. I genuinely want to know why anyone thinks this would improve education. According to reliable sources, per-pupil spending has increased 280% in the last 50 years, yet it directly correlates with a decrease in student outcomes over the same time period. Where do we need to increase funds that will directly correlate with improved outcomes? Story 77. I think that would be enough to build a new school or renovate one in every district that needed it, and that would simply make everything better. The environment in which you learn matters. Story 78. In Southern California, most of the schools were built in the mid-century modern style. That was essentially the last time the federal government cared about infrastructure and funding for children, about 75 years ago. Story 79. I really do not think we have a funding issue. What we have is a parenting issue. If you are not reading to your children every night and not taking an interest in their schooling, they will fail. Story 80. Salaries need to be increased. Teachers in my district make an average of $47,000 to $52,000, but they work long hours and have to deal with rude children. This drives away good teachers because their salary is not enough to make a living. Amazon pays just as much as teaching. What motivates someone to go to college for 4 years and take out student loans if they will make the same amount as someone without a degree? Story 81. It would be spent on wasteful expenses and have absolutely no impact on education levels in the country. I know this because per-pupil spending on education has increased exponentially over the past 100 years, and all we have gotten for it are more education administrators, not more education. What education needs is not more money but a change in philosophy and focus. Story 82. Nothing, because it is a spending problem, not a funding problem. We already lavish education with money, and it goes towards individualized education programs for children with severe behavioral disorders who will not graduate, as well as administrative bloat. We need truancy law reform and some sort of cap on administration as a percentage of total expenditure. Story 83. About the same amount as if they were given 1% better equipment. The problem is not as much about money as it is about the people in charge and what they see as important. Teachers still would not be paid better since it is controlled by the administration of the school district. 90% of school administrations would rather hire lawyer teams to disguise their incident reports than pay a teacher more money. The students still would not be treated fairly by the administration, and their problems would still be unheard or ignored. Look into some of the stories about the New York Buffalo School District. The teachers there are not able to call an ambulance if a student is unconscious. Instead, they are told to call the parents to pick them up, all because the administration is worried about looking good. If you truly wanted to fix schools, go after the administration of the school districts. They are the problem with schools more than a lack of funds. Story 84. I don't know how it would affect education, but it would likely cause immense, possibly debilitating damage to the military. One of the largest expenditures of the Department of Defense is personnel payments, and those cannot realistically be cut. This means the cuts would likely fall either on procurement or maintenance. Let's assume an even split. Most procurement projects would be canceled, and those that continue would be delayed, possibly bankrupting the companies with fixed-cost contracts such as the B-21. On maintenance, readiness rates would fall sharply, with many systems dropping below 50% availability. Major parts of the United States arsenal, if not the majority, would have to be scrapped, mothballed, or cannibalized to maintain the rest. This exact situation contributed to Russia's failure to win the war in Ukraine. Overall, this would likely prevent the United States Army from remaining the world's largest military power past 2030. China would most likely overtake it in overall capability by then. Story 85. This is one of those things that is a little hard to source because a lot of the spending happens at the state level. For 2024, 1/3 of the Department of Defense budget would roughly double the Department of Education budget. For that year, about half their budget was disbursements to the states, who in total spent around $1 trillion. If the half disbursed to states continued, you would move it from around $1 trillion to approximately $1.14 trillion. If the whole amount was disbursed, it would increase to approximately $1.29 trillion. This represents a 15 to 30% total budget increase. Federal redistribution does not tend to be even. It targets struggling areas the most. Therefore, you might see Massachusetts, which is already doing well with very little change, while a state like Mississippi could see a 50% increase. Story 86. The other 15% to universal healthcare. Scale that up over 15 years to 50%. We are still spending more on defense than anyone else. Story 87. We already spend more per student than most developed countries, and most of our metrics are still poor. It would simply be taken by the same corrupt individuals. Story 88. School boards and administrators would find a way to completely waste it on nonsense, and nothing significant would change. Story 89. If it were done suddenly, there would be a large spike in unemployment in areas where there are many defense contractors. Not saying it should not be done, but calls for massive defense cuts often seem to forget how much of the overall economy in some areas depends on defense spending. Story 90. The United States could increase teacher salaries, rebuild schools, offer free college or trade programs, and close education gaps quickly. Investing billions into children's futures would shift long-term power from weapons to minds. Just look at how Finland does it. Story 91. It depends on where the money would go. If it went into the pockets of administration offices, education would not be impacted. If it went to teacher salaries, we would likely see an increase in better educators and notice impacts in about 10 years. If it went to gymnasiums, we would likely not see any impact. If it went to school supplies, we probably would not notice much impact in the suburbs but would see some improvement in the inner-city districts. As a result of the increased funding, assuming it went to the right places, we would likely see a reduction in crime over a decade or two and more domestic stability. There would likely be a decreased burden on safety net programs during the same period. Personally, I feel that aside from teacher pay, school funding overall is adequate but poorly distributed. This is anecdotal but might indicate broader trends. I have noticed that some schools near me have a surplus of funding and cannot find ways to spend it. One high school recently submitted an idea to build an indoor football stadium. As a result, property taxes for those districts have been decreased. At the same time, inner-city districts have been struggling. Regarding impacts on the defense sector, we would likely see the retirement of many programs, a reduction in military personnel, and roughly 20 to 25% layoffs across contracting companies. I am not an expert in this area, so I have no idea of the geopolitical and war readiness impacts. Story 92. Cynical me says it would only result in bloat in administration, infrastructure, and feel-good technology equipment in classrooms. Schools lack the fortitude to tackle issues like parental responsibility, truancy, and low performance scores. At the same time, they are expected to correct social and psychological issues and teach simultaneously. If anything, the money should be spent on programs that address generational poverty, break cycles of trauma and violence before children reach 6 or 8 years old, and encourage couples to marry and stay together. Story 93. It would really help our country, but unless something is done about discipline in the classroom, the literacy rate will not improve much. Parents need to support correcting classroom behavior and attendance. When I was a student, disruptive behavior was not tolerated. Story 94. Education Project 2025 eliminates the Department of Education. They are not going to take money from the cash cow that is the Department of Defense. Story 95. As a teacher, I hope they would hire more teachers. There is a teacher shortage, but you would never know because schools are not hiring teachers. It is harder than ever to get a job as a teacher. What schools are doing is increasing class sizes. Your local school may say something like 17 students to 1 certified staff, which sounds like class sizes are 17 students. Not all certified staff are teachers. There are counselors, deans, assistant principals, and others. In reality, the average class size is 28 or more students. Below 30 students in most secondary schools is fortunate these days. The approximately 20-something average comes from small individualized education program focus classes and specialty elective classes that have about 12 to 15 students. I really hope some of the money would go to stabilizing class sizes because very few students do well in lecture hall style classes. I teach middle school, so God bless. Story 96. It will be a great day when your post reminded me of this. Came out when I was a kid, and I remember seeing it and having one of these flyers posted in my office when I was older. It was produced by the Women's International League for Peace, originally around 1965. Story 97. There is no meaningful difference if the money does not go to the right people. It just results in more money in the administrative staff's pockets and not with the actual teachers. Story 98. It would speed up the timeline for China to invade Taiwan and Russia to expand their war westward to other former Soviet bloc nations. We would probably eliminate a lot of domestic hunger and see some improved test scores along with a well-funded teachers' union. Story 99. Our education system has not improved despite increased budgets. Test scores continue to decline regardless of the funding, resulting in a weaker military. Story 100. Probably not much. We already pay more per student than any other country. We have structural issues that will not be fixed by throwing money at children. Story 101. Considering the performance of the education department, I would say it would be unwise to invite the entire world to come to the United States and enjoy themselves. Story 102. It would be a decent increase in spending, but I doubt it would accomplish much. The United States already spends a lot of money on education. Total education spending for the 2021 to 2022 school year was $1.64 trillion. If we redirected 30% of defense spending, that would be an additional $262 billion, an increase of 16%. Would it make a difference? Yes, but I believe that difference would be extremely marginal. If history is any guide, administrators would find a way to consume all that extra money without making any real difference in educational outcomes. My personal opinion is that the problem with American education has nothing to do with funding. The United States already spends 38% more than the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development average on elementary and secondary education, and more than double the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development average on post-secondary education. The problem is not funding. The problem is the parents. Parents need to be involved in their children's education. However, people who have no business being parents are having children. No amount of education spending can overcome indifferent parents. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.